Thank you so much. So let's see. So to get started today, I want to start with a few definitions since many people here are coming from different places. And when I explained Chesed Mitzvot and ritual Mitzvot to someone and legal Mitzvot, it just all went over their head. So a couple of quick definitions. Chesed, it can be kindness or loving kindness that goes above and beyond what is required to support other people. A mitzvah or mitzvot, plural, these are commandments from God used as the basis for Jewish law. Now, chesed is itself a mitzvah, but it's also a sephirah in Kabbalah. It's like a divine center of energy within the human body. It's also a soul trait in Musar, and it has additional uses. So it is a mitzvah, and it is more than a mitzvah. And the terms legal mitzvot and chesed mitzvot, those are two categories that I created for the thesis that I'll talk about a little bit further along. Now, the story which drew me in was about two rabbis who were arrested by the Romans. It's a story that's in the Talmud in Avodah Zarah 17b. And the crux of it comes down to this. Rabbi Hanina said to Rabbi Elazar, "You will be saved because you engaged in Torah study and in acts of chesed, and I engaged in Torah study alone." So we had these two ideas that Torah study alone, Rabbi Hanina, he was executed by the Romans, and Rabbi Elazar was saved, even though he was charged, had many more charges, had a much more serious case against him. So then we get this dramatic claim in the very next sentence. Anyone who occupies himself with Torah study alone is considered like one who does not have a God. And this is a story which stayed with me for years and years. I heard this long before I went to rabbinical school, and it always puzzled me and interested me. And the first thing that I did was to really dig deeper into this story. I looked at the historical context. I looked at layers within the Talmud. Like you'll notice, and you'll see this a few times, wherever there's light blue, that means that it's in Aramaic. And if it's in black, this means it's in Hebrew. So there's this earlier Hebrew teaching about people who occupy themselves with Torah study alone. And there's this Aramaic insertion which was added hundreds of years later to bring it into the context of this story. So could this really be true that the rabbis would think that Torah study alone was like not having a God? And by alone, I don't mean by yourself. I mean Torah study in the absence of doing acts of chesed in this context. Because Torah is and was central to Judaism. Way back in the book of Proverbs, it is a tree of life to those who grasp hold of it. We chant every week. Many of us, Etz Chaim Hi, or the song, "It is a tree of life for those who grasp hold to it." And this idea that suddenly that's not enough to kind of save you. It's like having the sun blotted out by something and the sky growing dark. This is something you pay attention to. There is something important that is being said here. So as we continue in this story, in the Talmud, we see a lot of arguments supporting this team, what I will explain is team chesed. So for example, the team law side comes along and says, "What do you mean Rabbi Hanina didn't do team chesed? There was once when his coins got mixed up with the charity coins, and he gave them all to the poor." So if Rabbi Hanina did chesed too, then the argument would not hold weight. But then we see, again in blue, meaning this was hundreds of years later, Team Chesed coming back and saying, yes, he performed acts of charity, but he was as rich as Warren Buffett. And all he did was this one time gave a few coins because they got mixed up. That's not chesed. He did not do nearly as much chesed as he should. So the argument or the claim still holds. And there were, in Avodah Zarah, there were 4 decisive arguments from Team Chesed. This initial Breita, and this story from Rav Huna, and then these example like I just showed you. And what I'm not going to show you is they went through each of the 5 charges in the trial, and during the trial, several miracles happened. There was actually divine intervention to save Rabbi Elazar. And he was acquitted. Even though he had all these things that were against the Roman law, he was acquitted and set free. And so this was so decisive that it was really impossible for Team Law to refute them. But they did not go away. They took a different tactic. They decided to ruin Rabbi Hanina's character. So it goes on to say he was sentenced to death by burning because he planned to pronounce the ineffable name of God in public. That is a heretic to do something like that. His wife was decapitated because she knew of his plan and did not protest. And his daughter was condemned to a brothel because she walked provocatively in front of the Romans. And when they noticed, she didn't stop walking that way. And then all 3 of them praised God's justice after learning their sentences. These are all, frankly, really weak arguments. They're made without attribution, or they were made in the names of rabbis who lived hundreds of years later. And that was part of the analysis as well. I looked and said, well, this rabbi, when did he live? He lived hundreds of years after this event, but he had a lot of credibility, and so he was inserted into this story. But even the commentators said, well, these look like looking for excuses to explain why the daughter or why the wife might have been executed, when there's a historical reality that the Romans often did collective punishment, and it would not be surprising that they would punish the family of someone who broke the law. So here, from this story, we have this push and pull between Team Law and Team Chesed. And I was curious, how far back did this go? Was this just something that existed in the Talmud, or were there roots earlier in Jewish text? And in order to do that, I needed to flesh out the 2 categories. It's not simply a case of the legal mitzvot or the chesed mitzvot. It also had to do with other characteristics. For example, Team Law would favor obedience to God, where Team Chesed focuses on knowledge of God. Team Law focuses on the mitzvot and the Torah only, whereas Team Chesed focused on all of Torah. And all of Torah is important because there are stories in Genesis, for example, where we can learn to practice Chesed by following Abraham's example or by following Rebecca's example. Team Law tends to prioritize global rules without exceptions, whereas Team Chesed would prioritize individual merit and exceptions to these global rules. Again, actions guided by rules. For Team Chesed, it's actions guided by God's attributes and by human examples. And another thing is on Team Law, they are okay with shaming and coercion, whereas Team Chesed would follow kindness and invitation, including when it comes to following the mitzvot. So first, we're going to go back a few hundred years from the time of the Talmud to the Mishnah, which for those who don't know is kind of an early version of the Talmud, the first effort at writing down the oral law. So this is from a section called Peah. And for those of you who are familiar with the morning service, you'll recognize this. So there are things that have no measure, which includes acts of Chesed and studying the Torah. And then it goes on to say there are things that we enjoy in this world and in the world to come. And that includes, again, acts of Chesed and bringing peace between colleagues. And it goes on to say, but the study of Torah is equal to them all. So this, to me, looks like a Team Chesed text where you're seeing that acts of Chesed, acts of loving kindness, are about equal to the study of Torah. But then we have what I think of as a little bit of a smoking gun to say that this story is deeper than just what happened. So if we look in the Jerusalem Talmud, and the Talmud, a lot of what it does is comment on the Mishnah. So it might say, well, what does the Mishnah mean by the study of Torah? And then it answers the question. Charity and acts of chesed are as important as all the commandments, the mitzvot of the Torah. So it is narrowing down the scope of the Torah to focus on just the laws and ignoring and eliminating other parts of the story, like the chesed stories in the book of Genesis that I was referring to. We also see this tension in the book of Ruth. You may be familiar with this story where Naomi, she goes to Moab with her husband and two sons. The husband dies, the two sons die after getting married. She starts going back to the land of Israel, and one daughter-in-law turns back, but the other daughter-in-law, Ruth, does not. And she says, do not urge me to leave you, to turn back. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Very famous statement. And it seems pretty clear that this is a Team Chesed sensibility. I'm going to go beyond what's required to be with you, my mother-in-law, to stay with you in your time of grief and my time of grief. I'm going to go back and be with you for your people. But some of the commentary, interestingly, recasts this as a conversation about mitzvot. They say we're just seeing Ruth's side of the conversation, and they provide Naomi's side. And it suddenly becomes a halachic discussion. So, for example, Naomi says, it is forbidden for us to be alone with a man. To which Ruth says, wherever you lodge, I will lodge. We also, I'm not going to show you any examples from the prophets, but there's many examples in the thesis from the prophets, from the Ketuvim, from Psalms. And so there is, of course, team law in the Torah. And we know a lot about the mitzvot and team law. Here's a section from Deuteronomy 11, chapter 13. If you obey these mitzvot, or sorry, chapter 11. If you obey these mitzvot, I will bring rain and grass for cattle, and you will eat well. If you worship other gods, God will be angry, and there'll be no rain, and you will perish. Therefore, impress these words on your heart and do them, so you and your children may endure in the land that God swore to your ancestors. So this is a classic team law sensibility where you're getting reward and punishment. It's super important for you to obey these mitzvot. Now, if you are knowledgeable in Torah, you might recognize these numbers as this is the second paragraph of the Shema prayer. The first paragraph is the Ve'ahavta. The second paragraph is this reward and punishment section. Third paragraph is about the fringes. If you're from a Reform background, you won't see this because this was taken out of the Reform liturgy for the most part. But so this is a very important part of what the rabbis chose to include in the Shema prayer. Okay, so let's look at Team Chesed. Well, also in Deuteronomy, if we look at 11:22, if you diligently keep this commandment, the mitzvah, to love it, to do it, and to walk in all God's ways. Now, Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik called walking in God's ways the most important of the mitzvot. This is the central mitzvah of the Chesed mitzvot, and I will explain what that means in just a moment. So if you do this, keep the mitzvot, and walk in God's ways, the Eternal will dislodge before you all these nations. So in other words, first we have, if you keep the mitzvot, you will thrive in the land. And here, if you keep the mitzvot and walk in God's ways, God will help you get the land in the first place. And what is so interesting is that Deuteronomy 11:22 with walk in God's ways is right after the Shema. The rabbis made an editorial decision not to include the part about walking in God's ways in the Shema. And so that was an editorial decision which kept the legal mitzvot, but it left out Chesed. Now, the Shema is the oldest of the Jewish fixed prayers, been around for almost 2,000 years, maybe longer. And I can't help but wonder, what did we miss not having walking in God's ways as part of this prayer for 2,000 years? What might that have meant if we had this other idea that, Chesed is also something important. Yes, of course we need the law, but we really need to walk in God's ways. So of course, this raises the question, well, what does it mean to walk in God's ways? Well, the answer is from the book of Exodus. And there we see, this is where God describes God's self. God says, the Lord God, merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abundant in chesed and truth, keeping chesed to the 1,000th generation. Gordon Clark, who did an extensive study of chesed in the Bible, said these attributes are echoed 14 times in the Hebrew Bible, and chesed is in all but one of them. So really, when we're talking about walking in God's ways, we're talking about emulating and following after these attributes of God. So I want to talk about why this matters. My last chapter before the conclusion talks about Team Chesed today. What difference might it make? What difference might it make if we could go all the way back to the Torah and say, wow, there's this other voice in Judaism, which maybe we didn't notice. And it's not always an accident that we didn't notice. For example, in Hosea 6:6, this is my translation, but it's very similar to many of the others. God says, I desire chesed, not sacrifice, knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. But we start seeing in the 1965 translation of JPS that it's, I desire goodness, not sacrifice. And okay, that's not the best translation of chesed, but it's okay. It's in the neighborhood. But rather than knowledge of God, it says obedience to God. Or in the most recent translation, devotion to God. I checked with Ravav, who is our head of the Hebrew department. There is no connection between da'at, the Hebrew verb for knowledge, and obedience. Not in any way, shape, or form. This is a change. This is taking someone's theology about what God is and how we should act towards God and making that theology into a commentary in the guise of a translation. This is another smoking gun for me. This dynamic that we saw hundreds and thousands of years ago is still in place today, where people maybe are not comfortable with elevating chesed to where it was originally in the Torah. So my final chapter before the conclusion is living Team Chesed today. And I give 4 examples of what this might look like if we wanted to center a Team Chesed sensibility in our own lives. One is to go above and beyond to help other people. We can take a Team Chesed approach to the mitzvot. There are many people who love following the mitzvot. They find a lot of spiritual elevation from keeping kosher, from not driving on Shabbat, and we can approach them from a place of love, from a place of invitation, and not from a place of coercion or not from a place of shaming. I talk about how one could create an introduction to Judaism class through, slightly misspelled, sorry about that, Chesed lens. And I'm sorry that I don't have time to share any of it with you today, but I'm also really excited about writing a Team Chesed Torah commentary. And I did a pilot looking at the story of Toldot, which is Jacob and Esau. And part of it is, Jacob recognizing that Esau suffered from food scarcity. And so he used to cook lentils for him every day after he would hunt. And they would go through this kind of mock discussion about the birthright, which was really kind of meaningless to them at the time. So I'm going to stop the share. So finally, what I just want to leave you with is this idea that it's okay to let go of team law. I think team law is part of our operating system. I think it's something we don't even recognize, even if we're in more liberal Jewish communities, that there's a little voice inside that's saying, to do it the right way, you really need to be following the ritual mitzvot. And I invite you, if you hear that voice, to realize that there is another voice in the Torah that says walking in God's ways is just as important. And then recognizing those ways that you show up Jewishly, and know that it's okay to kind of let go of that voice that says you need to be doing it differently or you're not doing it right. Thank you all so much for being here today.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you, Diane. Thank you so much, both of you, for your presentations. Our next presentation will be next Monday with Jill Goldwright and Neil Cronin. Please join us then. And Yasher Koch to you too.